Osaka's shadows. A murder is predicted, but the victim is already dead. Detective Takashi Sato hunts for answers, only to uncover a dark force manipulating fate itself. The deeper he digs, the closer he comes to a truth he was never meant to know. The rain poured relentlessly over the sprawling city of Osaka, casting long shadows across the alleyways and sending ripples across the otherwise still waters of the canals. It was February 2nd, 2024, a cold, dreary day that would soon become a turning point in the life of Detective Takashi Sato. As he stood under the flickering streetlight, his mind was preoccupied not by the weather or the hum of the city, but by a disturbing call he had received earlier that day. A woman had been found dead. It wasn't the usual type of case, a tragic but routine murder or suicide. No, this one was different. Her name was Ayaka Ishikawa, and she was already dead before she had even been murdered. According to an ancient prophecy, Ayaka's life would end in a brutal, unspeakable way, and yet she had already been gone for weeks. Takashi had no idea what was waiting for him, but something about this case felt wrong from the start. Something felt off. He had seen countless crimes in his years as a detective, but none had ever haunted him like this one. Something had snapped within the world itself. What was the truth behind this strange prophecy, and who or what was pulling the strings? As the investigation would soon reveal, the answer was far more terrifying than Takashi could ever imagine. The investigation into Ayaka Ishikawa's death quickly escalated from a perplexing case to a nightmare. Takashi Sato and his team arrived at the scene, a rundown building on the outskirts of Osaka. It was the kind of place where lost souls and forgotten memories clung to the walls like dust. The body of Ayaka Ishikawa lay sprawled across the cold concrete floor, but something about the scene sent an unsettling chill through the investigators. Ayaka had been reported missing weeks before her body was found, and the strange part was that her death had been foretold. According to a prophecy dating back centuries, a woman by the name of Ayaka Ishikawa would meet a grisly end, her murder predicted with disturbing accuracy. But Ayaka was already dead. Her body had been discovered well after the prophecy had come into play. Despite the gruesome nature of her death, the initial evidence suggested something inexplicable. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and no identifiable cause of death. She seemed to have simply died. As Takashi dug deeper, the puzzle pieces refused to fit together. How could someone be murdered after they had already been dead? This question haunted him as he gathered information from the few witnesses and pieced together Ayaka's life. She was a woman with a dark past, and a strange family, a history of mental health struggles, and rumors surrounding her that painted her as a troubled soul. Yet nothing about her past seemed to explain her death, nor the strange way she had been marked by the prophecy. As Takashi continued to investigate, he found that there was more to the prophecy than simple superstition. The source of the prophecy appeared to be tied to something ancient, something beyond the realm of normal understanding. There were whispers of a cult, one that had been active for centuries, whose members believed in a power that could manipulate time itself. It was said that the cult had the ability to foresee deaths and even influence the course of events, bending reality to suit their will. Takashi, always the skeptic, found it hard to believe in such notions. But the more he learned, the more he realized that there were forces at play that defied all logic. One evening, while reviewing old records in the archives, Takashi stumbled upon a set of strange symbols. Symbols that were identical to those found at the scene of Ayaka's death. It was a chilling revelation. These symbols, linked to the cult, seemed to suggest that Ayaka's death was not a random act of violence. She had been a part of something much larger, something far more sinister. As Takashi and his team delved deeper into the mystery, they uncovered more disturbing connections. There was something in the shadows, something watching their every move. As the case grew more complicated, Takashi's own sanity began to crack. Was he truly investigating a murder, or was he being manipulated by forces beyond his control? The lines between reality and nightmare began to blur. The very fabric of time seemed to unravel. Takashi realized he wasn't just chasing a murderer, he was chasing an impossible truth. And the deeper he went, the more he became convinced that Ayaka's death was only the beginning of something far darker than anyone could have predicted. The case took a dramatic turn the following day when Takashi Sato received a cryptic phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted, as though speaking through an ancient, broken device. The caller did not identify themselves but spoke with eerie certainty, sending a ripple of unease down Takashi's spine. The caller revealed something that chilled Takashi to his core. Another woman, similar to Ayaka Ishikawa, would be murdered again, according to the same prophecy. This time, the victim's name was not Suki Fujimoto. What unnerved Takashi further was the mention of a specific date, February 14th, 2024. The timing matched the next phase of the prophecy to a frightening degree. The caller hung up abruptly, leaving Takashi with nothing but a sense of dread and confusion. The tension in the air became palpable as Takashi's mind raced. How could the prophecy predict deaths before they happened? How could a murder be foretold with such precision? More importantly, how could the murder of Ayaka Ishikawa, who was already dead, lead to this chilling conclusion that another woman was going to die in the exact same manner? This call became the catalyst that sent Takashi spiraling into uncharted territory. For the first time in his career, he questioned everything he knew about reality. He gathered his colleagues, Hiroshi Yamamoto and Kaito Tanaka, to discuss the potential threat. The three detectives went over the evidence once more, analyzing every lead, every scrap of information. But there was one thing they couldn't shake: the realization that they were not simply investigating a murder. They were caught in something much more profound and terrifying than they could comprehend. As the clock ticked toward February 14th, Takashi's desperation grew. He could feel the walls of reality closing in on him. The prophecy wasn't just about predicting deaths. It was as if it had the power to influence them. Each step Takashi took brought him closer to the heart of a conspiracy that spanned generations, a web woven through Osaka's darkest corners. Takashi, ever the skeptic, couldn't deny the strange coincidences piling up around him. And with every passing day, the sense of inevitability became more overwhelming. The investigation into Ayaka's death had become something else entirely, a race against time to stop an unseen force that seemed to shape the very events unfolding before them. Takashi and his team began searching for connections between Ayaka's death and the prophecy, exploring every possible lead. But the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the truths became. They learned of a series of deaths, all tied to similar prophecies in different parts of Japan. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't just random killings. They were orchestrated, following a sequence that appeared to be both ancient and precise. The dread only deepened as Takashi discovered that the ancient symbols connected to the prophecy were still being used by a shadowy group that operated in the underbelly of Osaka. A group that no one had heard of for years, but whose presence lingered in the city's darkest corners, as though they had never truly disappeared. It was as if the prophecy wasn't merely a prediction of death. It was a curse, a cycle that repeated itself, and Ayaka's death had merely set it in motion once again. Takashi now found himself in a race against an unseen force. With the clock ticking toward February 14th, he had to figure out who the next victim would be, and whether it was even possible to stop the prophecy from claiming yet another life. But as he got closer to the truth, he began to question whether stopping the next murder was the key, or if the prophecy had already manipulated him into playing its twisted game. As the days marched relentlessly toward February 14th, the investigation spiraled further into chaos. Takashi Sato, Hiroshi Yamamoto, and Kaito Tanaka worked tirelessly, their nerves fraying as they uncovered more chilling details about the prophecy and the dark forces behind it. The team focused on one question: could they stop Natsuki Fujimoto from becoming the next victim, or was it too late? Every lead they followed seemed to vanish into thin air. There were no obvious connections between Natsuki and Ayaka, aside from the eerie coincidence of the prophecy predicting both of their deaths. But there was something unsettling about Natsuki's background that disturbed Takashi. She lived in a nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place where the walls seemed to close in on themselves. She had recently moved to Osaka from a remote village, one with a history steeped in the occult and ancient rituals, places where stories of curses and prophecies ran deep. Takashi began to suspect that the woman's connection to the prophecy wasn't just coincidental. Natsuki's family history had strange gaps, and her arrival in Osaka seemed like it could be part of a larger, hidden plan. Was she unknowingly caught in the web of something far more sinister than anyone had realized? As Takashi pieced together the mystery of Natsuki's past, a sense of dread gnawed at him. The more he learned about her, the more he felt that the prophecy had set its sights on her long before he had even known her name. Yet, despite his mounting sense of urgency, nothing could have prepared him for what came next. The team uncovered that the ancient symbols, which had first appeared at the scene of Ayaka's death, had been reappearing in strange, almost impossible places. Graffiti on forgotten walls, scratched into the sides of old shrines, and even etched into old, disintegrating books in the archives. The symbols were not just predictions, they seemed to be alive, a tangible force that embedded itself into the world around them. As if these marks were guiding the path to the next victim, pulling everything and everyone toward an inevitable conclusion. It became clear to Takashi that the prophecy was no longer just a tale of death. It was a malignant force in itself, one that twisted reality. The murders weren't happening randomly. They were occurring because the prophecy was actively driving them forward, as though fate itself were bending to its will. The presence of the symbols, appearing everywhere, was a manifestation of this twisted force, weaving a trail through the city toward Natsuki. As the days dwindled down to the fateful February 14th, Takashi's mind began to crack under the strain. His obsession with solving the case had turned into a near madness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led, no, manipulated, toward the death of Natsuki, as if the prophecy were controlling him just as much as it was controlling the people who were marked to die. Everywhere he turned, there were signs, warnings, and ominous symbols, each pushing him closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. And with each discovery, Takashi grew more unsure of his own sanity. Was this a supernatural force at work, or was he being driven mad by the weight of his obsession? The lines between reality and delusion began to blur, and he began to fear that the truth, whatever it was something he could never escape. The closer they came to uncovering the true nature of the prophecy, the more certain Takashi became that there was no way to stop it. But the ultimate horror lay in the realization that the prophecy might not be just about predicting death. It might be about controlling it. The investigation had already begun to take its toll, and the unsettling feeling that they were all pawns in a much larger game grew stronger with each passing day. As the night of February 14th, 2024, drew near, Takashi Sato felt the oppressive weight of impending doom pressed down on him with increasing intensity. The case had spiraled far beyond his ability to control, and every discovery made him feel like he was falling deeper into an abyss of madness. He had already lost count of how many nights he had spent in a haze of unease, combing through records, piecing together ancient texts, and scrutinizing every corner of Osaka. Each thread he pulled led to another horrifying revelation, and each new detail only deepened the mystery. The prophecy had not just been a warning about death. It had become an all-consuming force, shaping the events of their investigation in ways that defied reason. Every step Takashi took toward understanding it seemed to unravel the very fabric of reality. The symbols, which had first appeared as a cryptic puzzle, had grown more persistent, more malignant. They began to appear in places they shouldn't, on the walls of Takashi's own apartment, on the backs of old photographs, on the glass of the windows in his office. The more they investigated, the more it became apparent. The prophecy wasn't just predicting deaths, it was controlling them. Takashi and his team were merely pawns in a game they didn't fully understand, manipulated by forces beyond their comprehension. The night before Natsuki's predicted death, Takashi found himself wandering the streets of Osaka, his mind spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The city, with its maze of alleyways and forgotten corners, had transformed into something sinister, as though every shadow held a secret waiting to be uncovered. It felt as though the very air around him was charged with a dark energy, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. The supernatural elements of the case were bleeding into the real world, bending the laws of time and space. Every moment, every breath, was laced with an inexplicable sense of dread. Takashi's mind raced as he turned over everything he had learned. The symbols, the prophecy, Ayaka's death, it was all connected, but the connection was so tangled, so deeply entrenched in the city's darkest corners, that he couldn't see the full picture. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between reality and the unknown, unable to pull back. By the time he arrived at Natsuki Fujimoto's apartment, it was nearly midnight. The feeling of inevitability had reached a fever pitch. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find. Perhaps some clue that would finally unlock the mystery. Perhaps some shred of evidence that would prove he wasn't completely mad. But as he stood before her door, he realized that it was too late. The prophecy had already set its course, and nothing he could do would change the outcome. He entered the apartment with a sense of grim resolve, knowing that he was walking into a trap of his own making. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. Natsuki's apartment was sparsely furnished, the walls adorned with faded photographs and strange, abstract art that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. A cold draft whispered through the narrow hallway as Takashi's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could offer an explanation. Suddenly he froze. His gaze fell upon a piece of paper lying on the floor, crumpled but still legible. It was a copy of the same prophecy that had been haunting him for weeks. As he bent down to pick it up, the symbols that had been etched into the prophecy seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity, as though they were alive, shifting and changing before his eyes. It was then that Takashi understood. He had been manipulated from the start. The prophecy had never just been a prediction. It had been a force that had been guiding them all along, twisting the investigation to its own ends. The truth was far more terrifying than he had imagined. This wasn't just a curse. It was a manifestation of something far older and more powerful, an ancient entity that thrived on the manipulation of time and death. The murder of Ayaka Ishikawa, the foretelling of Natsuki's death, it had all been part of a cycle, a ritual designed to keep the entity alive, to feed it. Takashi's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a physical blow. The prophecy wasn't just something that had been written down long ago. It was alive. It had been influencing the events of the case, controlling the very lives of everyone involved. He had been a pawn, just like Ayaka, just like Natsuki. His obsession with the case had been a key part of its plan, a plan that had been set in motion long before he even knew he was involved. As the clock struck midnight, Takashi felt the temperature drop. A cold gust of wind swept through the apartment, extinguishing the light above him and casting the room into darkness. In the blackness, Takashi felt a presence, something ancient, something terrifying, standing just behind him. He turned, but there was nothing there. The oppressive sense of dread tightened around his chest as he realized that the true horror wasn't in the case itself, but in the realization that the case had never been real to begin with. He wasn't investigating a murder. He had been investigating his own destruction. Natsuki's fate was sealed, and as Takashi stood there in the dark, he knew there was no escaping the grip of the prophecy. The cycle would continue, and he was powerless to stop it. Takashi Sato stood alone in the darkness of Natsuki's apartment, his heart thundering in his chest. The oppressive cold pressed down on him, suffocating him in its grip. He felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, as though the city around him had ceased to exist, leaving only the weight of the prophecy and its horrifying influence. The true nature of the case had finally been revealed, but the truth offered no solace. In fact, it only deepened the terror. The prophecy had not just predicted deaths, it had orchestrated them, weaving the lives of its victims into a dark and endless cycle. He turned away from the glowing symbols on the floor, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as he stumbled back towards the door. There was no escape, no solution. His every move had been part of the prophecy, guiding him to this moment. The prophecy was not merely a string of coincidences. It was a living, breathing force that manipulated time, shaping events long before they unfolded. It had been waiting for him, for Natsuki, for Ayaka. And now, Takashi understood that it was far older and far more powerful than anything he had imagined. His investigation, his pursuit of truth, had been nothing more than a pawn's move in a game that had no end. As he exited the apartment, the air outside felt no different, but everything had changed. The weight of the prophecy lingered in the streets, an invisible force, pushing him toward an uncertain future. The city of Osaka, once full of life and possibility, had become a prison, its very soul bound to a malevolent force that was inescapable. Takashi had tried to fight it, to make sense of it, but in the end, he had learned that some forces could not be understood, only endured. The sense of inevitability that had taken root in his heart during the investigation now bloomed into a cold certainty. The prophecy would continue. It would claim more lives, and each death would fuel its dark power. Takashi knew that Natsuki's fate had already been sealed, just as Ayaka's had. There was no stopping it. The team, Hiroshi and Kaito, would have to carry on without him. Takashi had seen how their involvement had drawn them closer to the prophecy's pull, just as he had been drawn in. They would become its next victims, their lives intertwined with the same curse that had claimed so many before them. And perhaps Takashi himself was already lost to the prophecy that had manipulated his every step. He left Natsuki's apartment, but he did not know where he was going. Every path before him felt as if it led to the same destination, a place where the lines between life and death were blurred beyond recognition. The city of Osaka, with its ancient shrines and modern chaos, had become the battleground for a war between reality and the supernatural. And Takashi was now nothing more than a spectator in a twisted game with no winners. As Takashi walked through the rain-soaked streets, the city around him seemed to pulse with a dark rhythm, a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. The air was thick with something he couldn't name, a presence that had watched them all from the beginning, pulling the strings, orchestrating their every move. There was no closure. There was no escaping the curse. The prophecy had won. And yet, in the back of Takashi's mind, something gnawed at him. A flicker of doubt, a tiny spark of defiance. Could there still be a way to break free from the prophecy's grip? Or had they all been doomed from the start? As Takashi wandered deeper into the city, the weight of his failure pressed heavily on his chest. He had been consumed by the case, believing that understanding its intricacies would allow him to break free. But now, with Natsuki's fate sealed and the prophecy looming over him like an unavoidable storm, Takashi understood the futility of his efforts. The prophecy wasn't just a prediction of death. It was a force that existed beyond the realm of human comprehension. It bent time and reality itself, guiding every step of his investigation, every breath he took, toward a conclusion he could neither control nor escape. Osaka, once a city of bustling life, now felt like a crypt, its dark alleyways, towering buildings, and ancient shrines all witnesses to a malevolent entity that had existed far longer than anyone realized. Takashi's mind raced with unanswered questions, but each one led to the same terrifying truth. They were all pawns in an ancient game. He had been trying to outrun fate, but now he realized fate had already decided. As the rain fell harder, Takashi stopped in front of an old shrine, its wooden structure weathered and worn by centuries of existence. The symbols he had uncovered, the ancient markings, had all pointed to this moment, this place. There was no final revelation waiting for him, no grand solution to be uncovered. The prophecy would continue to claim its victims, regardless of any effort to stop it. But in that moment, amidst the silent storm, Takashi's resolve shifted. Though he could not change the course of the prophecy, he would ensure that its presence, its malevolent grip on the city, would never be forgotten. He would leave a record, a warning for those who came after him. There was no redemption, no escape, only the legacy of the prophecy and the haunting knowledge that some forces were far beyond human understanding. As Takashi stood before the old shrine, the realization settled in like a dark weight upon his chest. He had thought he was powerless, that the prophecy had already claimed its victims, and that nothing could be done to stop its relentless cycle. But as he looked up at the towering structure of the shrine, a strange sensation washed over him. A sensation that something deeper, something he hadn't considered, was still at play. The feeling was subtle at first, just a fleeting moment of discomfort, but it grew. His breath quickened. His skin tingled with the odd sensation that the world around him had shifted. Suddenly something changed. The air seemed to shimmer, the shadows from the surrounding trees seeming to stretch unnaturally. Takashi could feel it, the presence that had followed him from the beginning, that had whispered in the dark corners of his investigation, was not merely a supernatural force. It was something far more personal, far more intimate. It was connected to him, to his own past, in a way he hadn't been able to comprehend until now. The prophecy had not been some random series of events, a twisted fate set in motion by an unknown force. It was no coincidence that Takashi had become involved in this case. The symbols, the eerie markings, the inexplicable deaths, they were all linked to him in a way he never realized. He had been marked from the start, not as a mere investigator, but as a participant. His obsession, his pursuit of truth, his inability to let go, it had all been part of the plan. He had been drawn to the prophecy because it was his legacy, his fate. In that moment, everything clicked into place, like pieces of a puzzle falling into their rightful places. Takashi's mind reeled as he connected the dots. He had been investigating a string of deaths, but he hadn't noticed the pattern that was right before his eyes. The victims, their deaths, were all tied to him in an intricate web of bloodlines, ancient rituals, and curses. The truth was far darker than he had imagined. He had always felt a sense of unease about his family, about his past, but he had buried it deep within himself. His father had been a well-known figure, a powerful man who had seemed to have connections to forces outside the realm of law and order. Takashi had never questioned his father's influence, never considered the possibility that the darkness he had inherited was more than just the shadow of his past. But now, the horrifying truth became undeniable. Takashi's family line had long been entangled with the very forces behind the prophecy. His father's ties to the occult, his deep involvement in secret, forbidden rituals, they were not mere coincidences. They were deliberate, and Takashi had unknowingly been pulled into this world since birth. The prophecy had not been merely about Ayaka, Natsuki, or the other victims. It had been about him. The murder of Ayaka, the death of Natsuki, it was all set into motion by the bloodline Takashi belonged to, a bloodline that carried with it a dark inheritance that had been passed down through generations. As the realization dawned on him, Takashi's legs weakened beneath him, and he staggered back. His father's name echoed in his mind, an ancestor who had struck a pact, whose decisions had irrevocably linked the family to the malevolent force that controlled the prophecy. Takashi had spent his life trying to outrun the legacy of his family, trying to distance himself from the darkness that had shaped his upbringing. But now he understood. He had never truly escaped it. The entity behind the prophecy was not some unknown supernatural force. It was part of him, part of his lineage. The prophecy had been passed down like an inheritance, each generation marking those who carried the bloodline. His obsession with solving the case, his drive to understand the events surrounding Ayaka and Natsuki, had all been a part of the curse. Takashi wasn't just investigating deaths. He was feeding into a cycle that had been set in motion centuries ago, a cycle that could never be broken. Takashi felt a sickening sense of vertigo as the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The truth was far worse than he had ever imagined. There was no escape. There was no way to outrun the prophecy. It had always been his destiny, and no matter how far he ran, it would always find him, just as it had found Ayaka, Natsuki, and countless others before them. The prophecy was his curse. The cycle of death, of time bending and twisting, had always been part of his family's legacy, and he was destined to be its next victim. With his knees buckling beneath him, Takashi fell to the ground, his body trembling. The weight of his own existence, the legacy of darkness that had followed him all his life, now felt like an unbreakable chain that bound him to this twisted fate. The rain fell harder, the city around him now indistinguishable from the world of his nightmares. He had been playing a role in this nightmare all along, and there was no waking from it. The storm raged on as Takashi lay in the mud, the chilling realization of his fate sinking deeper into his bones. Osaka, with its ancient shrines and towering skyscrapers, no longer felt like a city but a tomb, a place caught between the living and the dead, where the prophecy's grip held sway. The air around him grew thick with something unseen, a presence that seemed to mock his helplessness, to feed off his despair. The rain continued to pour, washing away the remnants of his defiance, erasing the last traces of hope. As the night deepened, the city remained unchanged, its streets full of the living, unaware of the horrors that lurked just beneath the surface. Takashi, in his final moments, felt a growing sense of surrender, as if he had always been a part of something far greater and far darker than his own understanding. His struggle had been futile. There was no resolution, no salvation. The prophecy had already marked its next victim, and there was no escaping the consequences. In the distance, the faint glow of the city's lights flickered like a dying candle, their illumination a stark contrast to the all-encompassing darkness that enveloped him. The once vibrant streets, the pulse of life, now felt empty and hollow. The world he had once known had become a distorted reflection of itself, a world where the rules of time and death were not written in ink, but in the blood of those who had come before him. Takashi's mind, slipping into the fog of unconsciousness, drifted one last time to the thought that had haunted him throughout the case. The question that had never been answered: was the prophecy a force beyond their control, or had they in some way always been part of it? The city, the case, and the prophecy would continue without him. It would claim more lives, and the cycle would go on, stretching out into eternity. And in the silence that followed, the only sound that remained was the distant, almost imperceptible ticking of time, unwavering, relentless, and beyond human reach.